Applesauce. And yogurt. Hey, good morning. I need that water. That's I gotta have my protein to help. Yeah. Okay, so welcome. In the spirit of making sure that you don't have to do everything in the break, I decided not to give you a quiz this week, so you're welcome. Okay, just make sure to not lick too many doorknobs and be safe and enjoy a nice relaxing time. I am quite happy that spring break has changed quite a bit since I was in college. Or at least here. Okay, so are there any questions so far? Otherwise, we can just get into it. Okay, so we were talking about plants and you wouldn't be able to tell it from up here. We are going to talk about plant life cycles because a lot of the plant parts are talked about in 202 for physiology, but we've already talked about basically the structures in the basic plant and phloem and xylem and how liquids flow through that and get taken up from the soil in general terms. But we also want to have an overview of these plants and basically all these described differences between them. And since this is an overview class, I want to make sure that we're talking about essentially how they reproduce. And you can break it down to one simple picture. But I want to make sure that you understand with meiosis, which is making the sex cells. Plants go through this and have a haploid or half of their genetic complement. Now, this is a very simplistic picture because they're only talking about a couple. Excuse me. It was coming. I knew it was coming. The allergies are awful out there, guys. So they're only using a couple of chromosomes as an example, but these sex cells go through a different division than mitosis, where it's just the doubling and splitting of the chromosomes. They basically will swap parts of their chromosome with the other parental copy that we got, okay? And that will give us variation so that our kids don't look like our parents, okay? There are going to be familial traits that are shared among a group or sides of it, of these plants, but this will provide a unique organism. And then we split once and split again so that the chromosomes don't have their pairs. So they have half the genetic complement. Now with plants, you could have 6 copies sometimes. And even one, I remember it's a chrysanthemum or something like that, that has 12. Don't ask me. But what we get down to is that we don't have the doublets of chromosomes. So we can have some mixture with the essentially egg and sperm of plants where they will have, or whatever it is, we'll talk about that. So we have some variation. And some plants can self-pollinate, a number of them can't. There are like fruit trees that can't self-pollinate, so you have to have 2 of them, pairs and such like that. And some apples, I guess. But in general, we're going down to what we term one copy, okay, of these genes. So we term it haploid. And when we're down to haploid, we are talking about sex cells, also called gametes. And when we're talking about gametes, that means they have to be fused together to be viable for reproduction, in sexual reproduction. 2 gametes will come together that had been made by meiosis, two separate forms of meiosis, male and female, if you want to talk about it that way. And then they will have a viable zygote, which is reproducing organism on its own. Now, we understand that egg and sperm, and then we have the embryo or the zygote that will turn into the embryo, and then it will go through the stages to make a bebe. But in plants, we have something a little bit different. This will just end in the seed, the embryo that sits there until it germinates. Now, when I say seed, it can be a little bit different depending on the type of plant. So just remember haploid and diploid. Full genetic complement usually can go through mitosis and just make this. When we go through meiosis, we turn all of those cells going through meiosis into gametes, sex cells, half their genetic complement, haploid. We also term it 1N versus 2N in the diploid. Okay, it's confusing, but there we go. So we are going to talk about all these different plants briefly about how they fit this one cycle called alternation of generations. And I like talking about this not because I want you to memorize life cycles, but it is important because there's a lot more organisms out there besides plants that go through alternation and generation. If you like jellyfish, they go through that. Okay, the whole set of jellyfish do. There's a number of invertebrates that do. Okay, so we can basically, if you understand this one chart, we can apply this to all the different plants because they all have, in some way, shape, or form, this cycle. Now, some cheat and then make underground roots and make basically a clone of themselves that is still connected by the roots. That's still considered one organism. But here, we have the full reproduction. So think about this as parts in a compass. The north part, the top part, is the sporophyte. This is the full genetic complement adult that can make spores in that will be sex cells. So we have meiosis here, and all of a sudden we cross this line from diploid into haploid. And now we're talking about plant parts for structures that have gametes. So we're at 1N. So as soon as we cross this line, we go from diploid to haploid. And these are the sex replication cells. Okay. We usually term it a spore, at least at one point in their reproduction cycle. And then we get to what's called the gametophyte. Phyte, we mean talking about plant or plant type. And then gamete, well, it's making gametes. Okay. So this plant from the spore or this plant type will make gametes. So it's already in 1N, haploid. But this structure is still growing and viable. Sometimes inside the adult plant. It depends on the type. But initially, we're going to be talking about ferns and mosses, where they'll have an actual plant type. They'll grow this way for a long period of time. It isn't just like a seed or a flower. They have a whole part that is spending a lot of time in their gametophyte state. They have photosynthesis, they're green, all that stuff. So this line here, if it goes up or down, showing that there's more time in the sporophyte, it'll go down here so that there's less time in the gametophyte. But initially, we're going to see there's a lot of time where the plant, in this case a moss or a fern, live in a haploid state, in a gametophyte state, and just pump out a lot of gametes. So this line moving up and down will actually give us a lot of information on which life cycle part it lives in. So we have the gametophyte, which produces the gametes, and usually it's two different types, male and female structures. And however those happen, male and female structures, the magic of fertilization has to happen where we have two gametes coming together, fusing or in causing fertilization, which gives them a 2N genetic complement. So the full genetic complement. Okay. So we don't have one copy, we have two of everything. And then we call that a zygote. Sometimes it's a seed. Sometimes it's actually just a stalk, which we'll talk about, and it develops into the sporophyte. And they look very different depending on the plant. We think of a sporophyte out there, trees, but it isn't always trees. Okay. So if you get down these terms and where they are and what they mean, you're going to be well ahead on these multiple choice and matching and orientation of where you are in a plant cycle. Now, one other thing I forgot to talk about, IUM. Have you ever heard of gymnasium instead of gym? It's talking about a place where they're having sporting or athletic events. IUM means a structure. Okay, so whenever you see a IUM here, it means there's a structure for whatever it's talking about. Sporangium, it's making spores. It's a chamber to make spores. Okay. So use those clues of the scientific terminology to figure out where you are in the cycle. If you can get these parts down and you're confused about a very complicated cycle, at least you have this and it can kind of give you an orientation and go, okay, let's calm down the frantic hamster wheel and go, I know these things. I know sporophyte, gametophyte, we have fertilization and meiosis, and then we have diploid and haploid. Okay, I know these things. What do these mean? Let's calm down the panic and then go from there. Fill in what we know. Okay, so we're going to talk about this shortly. Now, just to talk about what the initial plants, the bryophytes. These are kind of fleshy sometimes, like the liverworts and the hornworts. They're not very tall. They get to about 6 to 8 inches tall max, but a lot of them are much smaller. We know about a lot of them with as mosses. That grassy verge that isn't just shrubs, but that perfect idealistic or idyllic, I should say, wood scene where it's all carpeted with green that isn't poison ivy at all, but it's nice and soft. You could lay down there and sit there. It's usually wet though, so it kind of ruins the whole idyllic setting when you're sitting there. But it's quiet and it's a beautiful setting in the picture at least. So what's the problem with the bryophytes? There isn't really a problem, but they don't have any true stems or true roots or true leaves. Why? Because they don't have any vascular tissue. They don't have phloem and xylem. So what are some of the problems that you could see a plant running into that doesn't have phloem or xylem? And this is why I talk about it here.
No way to transport nutrients.
Exactly. No way to transport nutrients. It's going to have to basically diffuse from that area. There's also no major storage areas where they can store a lot of starches and then transport them and release them into sugars when they need to grow. So a lot of this diffusion will, it's a lot of diffusion instead of active transport. So there's only so big you can grow before this becomes a problem with anoxic or lack of oxygen in or certain areas and like roots and lack of CO2 transported throughout the body. Okay, so non-vascular means it doesn't have any true roots and things like that. Now, it needs usually a lot of water or moist areas. You don't see this in the desert for the most part. And that's mostly because they have sperm. You wouldn't know that from the mosses, but they actually have flagellated gametophytes. And by definition, that's a sperm. Okay. Think about that the next time you sit on some moss. But for the most part, they live in the gametophyte stage, which means they are making gametophytes most of the time. So that green, mossy kind of with the little flecks that look like leaves and the little stalks that are about this tall, that's all the gametophyte stage. Okay. Let's take a look at a couple of these. Here's a hornwort, or sorry, that's a liverwort. The reason they call it a liverwort is because they have these lobes on here, and somebody decided that, hey, this plant looks like a liver. I'm not really seeing it. If I squint sideways and take off my glasses, I just see a green mass. So sure, liver. But it's talking about these lobe parts, and we have a couple in the greenhouse. I just couldn't move them. They're in big pots. Okay, we also have hornworts, which are describing their sporophyte stage, where their adult stage, if you want to think about it. And these will start pointing out with mosses and such that you can have the gametophyte and the sporophyte growing together. It isn't like one blooms and then dies off, and then you only have one stage at a time. This one can have both. So the spike here, that little horn, which is why they're called that, is the sporophyte, and then the gametophyte is still chugging away down there, still making more gametes. Another good example, a number of the hornworts, if you've ever run into this in Wisconsin lakes, these are what we would consider seaweed or something that you kind of panic swimming through in deep water or whatever, or at least my kids do. And it washes up. This is a hornwort. A number of these will have little bladders of air or little sections of air in them to cause them to float vertically in the column of water so they can get the most sunlight and most photosynthesis. So you don't see them after a certain depth. But it's kind of cool to think about. Yeah. Now, there are other plants like seaweed in the ocean that you can see that like bladderworts and stuff like that are more warts, and the warts, these warts, and they have little air bladders in them, which is kind of cool. You can step on them and pop them. My kids love that, going to the ocean and such when we can. We're from Wisconsin. We're gonna take these small joys of going to the ocean when we can. Okay, and then we have the moss, the traditional moss that we have, and what you're seeing for the most part is just the gametophyte stage there. So when we look closer, we can see these little star-like things. It's basically a stalk that holds it up. Sometimes they're really closely held, but these are very commonly found in Wisconsin. Okay, you go into any of these normal, a little less so in like oak savannas because there's more openness and it's a little bit more acidic, but you can find these essentially anywhere. Some of them are tighter woven, so it's harder to see these, but the regular moss is there. And then once in a while, you'll see some of them sticking out this stalk. It looks almost, when it's fully ready, it almost looks like a periscope or some kind of like little flag you would put up during snow removal season to make sure somebody doesn't run over something or go into the ditch. Hello, Wisconsin. But this stalk and this little capped structure is the sporophyte. That is all there is. We think of regular adult plants like a tulip or a flower or a tree. This is all there is for the mosses, the bryophytes. Okay, so when we think about this, when we think about the life cycle here, we can apply this. Oh, sorry.
Oh, so I've been to like a bog in like northern Wisconsin.
Oh yeah.
And like the moss like blows on top of bog, and you can like walk on it. So what they said.
I love those. Yeah. So they have enough of these structures that almost look are roots, but not underneath, that are woven into each other. Plus, it traps a lot of air. And there's a thick enough mat you can walk on. When I was younger, I could do this, but yeah, those are really fun, aren't they? I love those, but if you jump on them too much, you might go through. And good luck. Bogs are a very fascinating ecosystem, and that's where you find a number of the carnivorous plants and stuff. But yeah, essentially, you just have a thick enough mat there. Yeah, if anybody can go to a bog, it's, I wish I could do a field trip there, but there's none in this area that I know of. But there's a really nice one over in Maine that they have as a state and a national wildlife area. You go on a long boardwalk, and that's where I saw the sunnydews and stuff like that, but it's a huge, huge bog. It's pretty in a weird alien kind of way. Okay, so if we apply this life cycle to this plant, this bryophyte, we have root-like structures, we have stem-like structures, we have leaf-like structures. None of them have vascular tissue. But this thing growing at the top is where fertilization happened, and that zygote grew into this stalked thing. This is the sporophyte. It has two ends, it has a diploid structure. All this structure is basically the sporangium. It is a place to make spores. That's it. It doesn't make flowers or anything. It is a place to make a whole bunch of cells that will divide through meiosis into spores. That's it. And what will happen is it has a little cap here. And after it makes all these spores, this cap will go pop open and release the spores. And then they will spread by air currents and sometimes water currents until they will essentially not really germinate, but grow into a gametophyte, which is shown here. Now, remember, as soon as the sporangium, and the sporangium is where the spores are made, the action that's going on inside those to make the spores is meiosis. So it isn't like the sporangium turns into spores. The cells within the sporangium undergo meiosis. Yes.
And the sporangium is that, just that top.
Yeah, the sporangium is just this. The whole thing here, the stalk and everything is the sporophyte. The sporangium is just that structure. Right? Yes.
So is that like popping where it releases all the spores, kind of similar to like what other plants do, like in the spring when it?
Yeah, it isn't as pressure sensitive, yeah, from what I understand. Is but like jewel weed or something like that that spits out the or puffball or something like that. But yeah, it opens it up, mechanical movement by the wind and things brushing up against it. Okay, so we have the gametophyte, and it'll grow in most of its life as a gametophyte, which it has a male and a female part to it. Okay, so they make egg and sperm, and then the sperm have to get to the egg. Sometimes it's because the two structures run into each other due to mechanical movement or what have you. Sometimes it's just enough water in that area. This is why they need water, is they actually have that sperm. Okay, this is more complicated than what it looks like, but it's the same thing. We have the sporophyte. It is grown from a zygote off the top of the gametophyte, and it makes that immature sporangium and then grows it up on that stalk. Here's a better picture of it where we have that capsule, and it has this little cap that opens up when all the spores have been made through meiosis, not before. And I like this picture, but this is why I talk about it. So, sporophyte and the sporangium, I need you to know, sporangium is going to be a common term. Oplercum just talks about a cap over a structure. And we talk about oplercums for fish too, that's that hardened part over their gills. It's just a structure, that's all it is. and this one's a cap. I don't need you to know that there's an operculum or teeth. I need you to know that this is a sporangium and this is the sporophyte. We undergo meiosis, and through meiosis, all those pre-spores basically become spores because they are one end. And so therefore we go from diploid to haploid. That's an important one to remember. If you can remember which side is diploid and which side is haploid, you go, oh, we go through, get to haploid through haploid status by going through meiosis. And so these are all spores, and this is the gametophyte because it's one end. So you have these spores that lay down in the proper environment, and they make something that looks like roots, and they make something that looks like leaves. They develop into these structures that are the full gametophyte, and they look somewhat similar unless you're really into mosses and get really close with a microscope or a magnifying glass. Thank you. I need a break too. Okay. And what you'll see is it makes these little pods where essentially the sperm are stacked up like a clip on a gun, basically. And when they release, the sperm are let out in the water and they'll swim. And they will swim when these droplets of water are touching these different gametophytes to the archegonium. And I need you to know antheridial, because anther is either pollen, but pollen has has sperm in it. So anther is talking about the male part of the gametophyte, the male structure that makes sperm. And archegonium is always talking about the structure that houses and makes the egg in the gametophyte. So if you know archegonium, oh, the female egg structure. Antheridium, oh, the male sperm, if you want to call them male and female. It's just how they make their gametes. So either way, the sperm has to swim to the archegonium, fertilize that egg, and through fertilization, you have one end plus one end equals two end. You have the full genetic complement to make a sporophyte. And then the beauties of fertilization happen, zygote is made, and that divides multiple times to make that sporophyte. And the circle of life continues. Note that the line is much higher here, signifying that the gametophyte stage is the long-term stage. And they can happen at the same time. Different way. But hopefully I haven't ruined you for sitting on mosses or enjoying the green verge in the woods. You might not sit on it as much though. Questions? We go forward. Okay, so bryophytes have a number of uses. Of course, water retention. They also help cycle many dead pieces of other organisms. Okay, so they can break down more of the dead material. They are very tolerant of desiccation. Many of them can be taken from a nearly dry state or pretty close to it and put back on water, and then they start growing again. Okay. For water retention, it's really great, but sometimes the ground can get impacted below there because nothing else can grow underneath it or grow through it. Now, if you've ever used peat moss or your parents have used peat moss, this is kind of a dry, crumbly material that helps lighten soils. You'll put it in there. And that's all it is dried, compacted sphagnum moss. So that green moss I used, it's a very common one. We have peat moss or peat bogs over in Eau Claire area and La Crosse area that are used and collected over time agriculturally, basically. And then dried out, packaged, and sent all over the US. for vegetable growing and gardening. Oddly enough, there is one bacterial, there is one fungal infection that is called Sporothrix shechni that is causes an infection on your skin. It's called rose sorter's disease. And landscapers and people who work with gardening equipment and just garden get it more often than not. And it's because of some this fungus growing in the sphagnum moss. I'm getting to my point, don't worry. We had a large outbreak due to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, a couple decades ago, where it was infecting all the peat moss. They dried it out, sent it out to all these different places in the US, and all these gardeners got this really nasty infection that causes lesions and sometimes death, but they caught it in time for most of them. But it was all due to one place getting infected and sending out to a whole bunch of peaceful, otherwise harmless gardeners that get attacked by this fungus. Fungus infections are very hard to get rid of, and it does some awful things to you. Now, the other interesting thing is that, or a couple interesting, is that it's a very good source of fixing CO2 for a long time. And what you'll want is long-term CO2 fixation outside of the soil. So what out of the atmosphere. All this means is we're taking CO2 and building carbon structures, larger, solid carbon structures, and keeping it there so it isn't contributing into the atmospheric part of it. So trees, mosses, and then coral is another really good example of that. So why it's a good way, and by the way, burning this stuff, peat moss in Scotland and Ireland and stuff like that, it smells. Holy cow. Pass on it. But we don't know quite why, but unless we really grind it up, it doesn't break down. There are things that do not break down. And usually it's fungus and other things. So somehow they are fighting that off, or don't have the weaknesses that other bacteria, or the bacteria, the plants, and the fungi can break down for energy sources. So that's why we put it in soils, to lighten soils long term. They're minuscule structures to hold apart the plant or the soil particles so it doesn't compact, for long-term benefits. We can also use this to pick up heavy metals. So it can be used for phytoremediation that we were talking about, where it'll soak up heavy metals over these areas, and we can just scrape it off the surface, roll it into a carpet, and try to remove the heavy metals that way. So these are ecologically pretty important. Okay. Questions about bryophytes? Yeah, we all need break. I understand that. That's okay. I have my coffee. Okay, so I think I already had that, right? No, yeah. Okay, just in advance. So pterophytes, because that P is silent, are basically what we would consider ferns. We are getting close to that time where you're going to see these little curved structures, are one of the first things you see out, besides bloodroot white flowers all over the place. And these are called fiddleheads. And here's an example of them. The fiddleheads are curved, they go in bundles. Those are baby ferns. Okay. They'll unfurl and then widen out their leaves. Okay. They actually have leaves now. They actually have somewhat of roots. They actually have stems, because, yay, this group of plants actually have all those structures I talked about. The xylem and phloem, the vascular tissue. This means that they can grow larger, and sometimes you'll see that, again, idyllic picture of a woods or a deep woods where they have nothing but ferns. That I grew up in the Return of the Jedi time, so I always imagine Ewoks are gonna pop out of them. Attack me. I don't trust them. But we have that transport, so we can have that growth. Now, the one difference is between that and trees and bushes and things like that, is we don't have seeds yet, we still have spores. So this is vascular plant, non-seed bearing. Okay. Now, I love ferns, they're really fun. There's a couple of examples of that don't look like ferns, but they have this wisp-like ability that really particleized or pixelated, sorry. But they have these structures on them that are the sporangium, so the spore forming parts. They don't look like really the moss sporangium, but these are the spore forming units on this. Okay. Another example are ones that you can see in the woods. Sometimes you'll have oak or deciduous forest, and then you have a couple of things that look like pine trees, little baby pine trees popping up, and it's usually a thicket of them or a circle of them. It looks, some people used to call them fairy circles, or one version of fairy circles. Okay, and fairies aren't real. Okay, just being clear. Oh, sorry. Man, I killed 2 people. Okay,
I was gonna wake up with one end of my pillow.
well, we might. I don't know. It depends on how nice your roommates are. Okay, so this looks like a little pine tree, but it's actually a fir. And the reason you have them popping up in a localized area, and it looks like just it's a very odd, almost unnatural structure, is because they're connected by these roots, these rhizomes. And so you can have them popping up and growing around all of each other in these root systems. But this is not a moss, and it isn't a tree, which is confusing why they call it club moss. Okay, it's actually a fern. And I like seeing them about this time of year. Okay, so this one I really like to look for when I'm hiking. If you are doing more long-term hiking and you run out of a scrub cleaner or a sponge to clean your cooking instruments, you can look for something like that called a horsetail, and this is usually indicative of a water source or a seep somewhere nearby in case you need water. But these very odd, very old plant structures are very high in silicates. So they can be used to clean things better than other plants. You can break off a section of this and it won't kill the whole plant unless you take it from the bottom. And you can use this as a kind of a scrub. It'll actually stick together pretty well because of the silicates in there. Now, should you be destroying nature? No, but I pointed out because of the interesting characteristics of it. There are many fossil records of things that look very similar to this, where we have the branches and there's kind of leaves in these sections in a radial pattern, so they come out in every direction off the stem. Okay, so different ferns, different types of them. We usually think of ferns as this. Many of us, out of desperation to have some kind of outside landscaping, will throw these around at random to hide imperfections in our house. I mean, other people, of course. But maidenhair is a very common one you'll see inside. We have a gigantic version of it in our greenhouse. That large pot that looks like it ate somebody. It used to be this big. I still have not figured out what Dr. Farley did to it, possibly fed it radiation, but it has gotten big. Okay, and we also have heart tongues. That one's pretty, and sometimes people use it. And then we have the royal fern that is used quite regularly. But the reason I'm bringing this picture up is you can see these structures underneath. Those are sporangium underneath. So sometimes you can get ferns, and the one in there isn't doing it right now. But have you ever done a art photo or one of those in grade school where you take a black construction paper, you take a leaf from a fern and you put it down there and let it sit, or a fungal cap, and you let it sit, and all of a sudden there's this white outline of the whole structure. Well, the fungus are releasing spores in a very large pattern, and the ferns that have those sporangium underneath them are releasing the spores too, and you can pick them up as this kind of white smoky appearance, depending on if it's sometimes you also do it on white paper depending on the color of the spores, but you can have this black outline too of the spores. So they are releasing them constantly into our environment. Yeah, okay. So when we're looking at this and comparing it to the life cycle here, we note some differences, okay? We still have diploid and haploid, we have sporophyte and gametophyte, fertilization, meiosis, great. We have our cardinal directions, we're not panicking yet. But when we're looking at this, we notice that the sporophyte is the dominant time that this plant is spending in its life cycle. So we have more time in the sporophyte, the 2N situation, we're making more spores because of it, and we spend more time, so there's a larger part of the circle in the diploid, the 2N. There's a smaller time in the haploid. Okay. Now the gametophyte is something that looks, and they keep showing it as a picture of a heart. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's very small. Sometimes it's bigger like this. It has a cleft in it here, and it has the roots here. Now, a lot of the time you'll see like bundles of ferns, right? And then they get closer and closer to each other. Well, that's because the gametophyte just drops out a lot of the time. And we have this gametophyte growing multiple sporophytes from this because they're all being fertilized right at this cleft. That's where the archegonium, where the eggs are. Sperm's made on this end, and they swim over or on top or whatever and fertilize multiple eggs there. So you have multiple zygotes popping up from that area and multiple ferns, the ones that you see. Okay, cycle of life. Here's a little bit more complicated, but we don't panic because even with all these pictures and such like that, we know fertilization, meiosis, sporophyte, gametophyte. Okay, so we start out with the zygote. It grows straight up through this gametophyte and produces this sporophyte. Okay, so I need you to know that the zygote goes into the sporophyte, what it looks like, and then it makes these things called sori. The sori are basically covers for the sporangiums, and there's a lot of them. So the sori aren't the sporangiums, but it's a cover for the sporangiums to protect them. Some of them are very obvious. Some of them are oblong, dark, shadowy outlines on the leaves that you can't really peel them up and look at them, but they're there and they're very flat structures to make and protect these sporangia. Drew.
Is there like, when I was a kid, I used to like touch ferns. I don't know what they were, but they would like curl up. Is that what you'd be saying?
Sensitive ferns. I have seeds for them. We should start some. I keep forgetting about it. But yeah, you touch them and they fold up. I love them. Yeah, they're fun. The key is not to let anybody else, say, who walks through the greenhouse, touch them all the time because the young ones die from all that stuff. But they're really fun. They're actually in Grenada as part of the grasses a lot of the times, but they have thorns. Yeah, but maybe we should try to grow some in the greenhouse now that we have a watering system and have everybody bring home one. That would be kind of fun. So I'll try to grow some. Okay, but yeah, those are the sensitive ferns are great. They're really fun. So yeah, okay. So we have the sori and then the sporangium in there. Don't worry about the indusium, the annulus or that sorus are the plural of sori, okay? Don't worry about that, just know that the sori contain thousands and millions of these sporangium. All these sporangium doing are causing all the cells inside it to undergo meiosis. As soon as they undergo meiosis, not the sporangium, but the spores in there can be released. And they're released, and when they land on a correct moisture-filled surface, they will grow into the prothallus. And I will like you to know that term. Prothallus is basically the gametophyte. It looks kind of like a really disturbing Valentine's part. Okay, so there's a cleft, there is a point to it, that's where the spore originally was, and that all this developed out of, and it has little rootlets to it. So, this structure is actually interesting because it has polarity to it. And all I mean by polarity is that there's a difference in parts of the structure, very specific differences. This cleft has all the archegonium, the egg producing places. And the tip side, I guess, or the pointed part, the bottom of the heart here, is where all the archegoniums are. Sorry, all the antheridium are. Sorry, I was looking at archegonium and I said archegonium. Archegonium are the egg parts in this cleft. The bottom part of the heart there is where the antheridium are. And all the antheridium are is a structure that produces sperm. So, that small amount of water that I talked about that is in and around the soil, usually under the leaf litter so it keeps it nice and moist, is enough for the sperm to swim out, and you're never going to look at forest soil and moss the same way ever again. And it swims out and fertilizes that egg. It doesn't get ejected out after that, but the zygote will just grow from that part of the prothallus. So you can have multiple zygotes being made every year and more of them. That's why they make it in this kind of bouquet. At the base of every of those like growths of multiple fern heads is a prothallus. It might not be big.
Aren't they mostly self-fertilizing?
They can be self-fertilizing, yes, yeah. Which is nice for landscapers again. I finally got a number of them set up where they're now self-replicating now. So, okay, this is what a sori looks like sometimes, and next time we will talk about the rest of these, the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Okay? No quiz. Be safe. Don't do anything I wouldn't. You know what? Just be safe. Okay.
Right?
Have a good break.